The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this NQA webinar. This is part of our series of webinars to help you transition to the new ISO 9001-2015 standard. My name is Margaret Rooney, and I am a regional assessor within NQA, and I also have a role in assisting our clients with the transition and the various questions and queries that you have around the transition. Now, today's webinar is focused on, as you can see on the slide there, three main themes or new themes, new concepts, increased emphasis on context, the process approach, and risk-based thinking. So this is what this particular webinar will be focusing on. This is not going to be a clause by clause of the new standard, nor will it be going into the techniques around the transition process itself. If you have a question, please do enter it as we go along. On the bottom right hand of your screen, you should see a box marked chat, and please feel free, if you have questions or comments, to enter those as we're going along. And we have a few minutes at the end of the webinar to take questions and comments. I shall do my best to answer any questions that you have. If there is anything I can't answer immediately, we're very happy to get back to you after today. And indeed, if there are any issues that you feel you'd like to see covered in more detail after today, do let us know that as well. So the objectives of today's webinar: to describe a process, to consider interactions between processes, to consider risk, to understand risk analysis to manage a process, and to consider context. So we'll actually be picking up on context nearer the end of this presentation. Let me emphasize that I shall be working hard this afternoon. I hope to try and keep this as simple as possible, which I know probably those of you listening in are at various stages in your understanding of process and risk. So I am trying to keep this simple. ISO 9001-2015, as you know, places explicit emphasis now on process and risk, and this presentation is to help you focus and understand these. And let me emphasize that this is not going to be achieved overnight. We shall all learn and understand more as we together become increasingly used to the new expectations associated with the 2015 standard. And that is the philosophy behind the fact that we have a series of webinars over the last few months and over the coming few months, so that we can all continue to learn and to share experiences. So starting off with the process approach. And I know this has given some people some anxieties, so hopefully I can try and allay some of those this afternoon. As I emphasized, I want to keep this very simple. Perhaps for some of you, you'll feel a little too simple, but please bear with me. So a very simple process consists of inputs, which could come in the form of requirements. Then we have an operation. What is it that actually needs to be done? And then we have our output, the results of our process. So an input, for example, could be a drawing, a set of instructions on a drawing, a set of work instructions. A lot of NQA clients work in this way. You have some work instructions. There is an operation or an activity to be carried out. So something needs to be done. You carry out that instruction, and there is an output. Now that output could be a product or service, or it could be an interim stage of the product. But the thing is, the output is the value add of your process. So we all operate processes every day. We're not necessarily thinking in that way or recognizing that we're carrying out processes, but we use processes all the time. So, sticking with the very simple process, I know this looks like a series of aeroplanes on the slide, but hopefully it'll make sense in a moment. Let's take a very simple process that we're all familiar with, making a cup of tea. We have our inputs, which would be water, tea, milk, sugar. Then we have the operation. What is it that we need to do? Well, there are several of these involved. We boil the water, we put tea in the pot, we add the boiling water, we allow it to brew, we put milk in a cup, we add the tea, some of us may add sugar, and we stir it. So that's the operational side of this process, and the output or the outcome is a lovely cup of tea, and that's the value add that this process has given us. And then that particular process feeds into the next process, which is hopefully the enjoyment of drinking the tea that the process produced. I use this example because many years ago, when I was first introduced to the process approach, the lecturer actually used the concept of making a cup of tea, and I found that very helpful. What he didn't talk about, of course, was risk. That's the other element that we'll talk about this afternoon. So, what is a process? In summary, it's an activity. It has an input and an output. It's a transformation. We take inputs, we do something to them, and create outputs. And in turn, those outputs could become the inputs to further processes. So looking at the process approach, and this is our first reference directly to the standard here, clause 4.4 of the 2015 standard includes specific requirements around the adoption of a process approach. Now, I'm not here going to go through the whole clause, but I'm just teasing out some key elements of it. It talks about inputs and outputs. It talks about sequence and interaction. We need to determine the resources needed for our process, and we need to think about risks and opportunities within the process. And we need to evaluate and implement any changes needed. So these are the key points coming out of the clause around the process approach. So let's go back to our cup of tea. Our inputs and outputs, the tea, the milk, etc., amount to the inputs, and the output is a drink, the drink of tea, the cup of tea that we have made. Sequence and interaction. Well, in fact, if you remember under the operation, there were quite a few, you might say, sub-processes going on. So, for example, we can be putting tea in the pot while the water is boiling. We can be getting the cups ready while the water is boiling, getting the milk out of the fridge. So there's various things that we do in sequence and in parallel. Determining the resources needed. Well, to make our cup of tea, we're going to need a teapot, a kettle. We're going to need some energy to boil that kettle. We're going to need a cup, a spoon, and indeed a person to make the tea. These are all the resources that our process is going to need. And then we need to think about addressing the risks and opportunities. Check there is actually some tea in the cupboard before we start the process. Is the milk fresh? What do I do in a power cut? This is absolutely true. I actually keep a small camping stove so that if I have a power cut, which I have occasionally had in the past, I can still have my cup of tea. I didn't think of it as a risk measure at the time, but in practice that's what it is. And then the standard also says we need to evaluate and implement any changes needed. Well, actually, in making the cup of tea, I perhaps discovered that Auntie likes her tea a bit stronger than I've made it. And indeed, she's not actually fussed on the brand of tea that I used. So we're getting some feedback, some evaluation that will make us rethink our process. We need to change it slightly. We're going to need to leave the tea in a little bit longer. We're going to have to look at our inputs again. We actually perhaps need to think about a different type of tea. So as I say, this is a very simple example that hopefully we all know and understand. But this is the sort of thing, to illustrate the points that the standard is making, to illustrate the process approach. And again, just looking at it in a high-level way at a simple process approach and the associated risks. That's the other theme of today. So again, we have the same process flow. Sometimes it's useful to do the process flows vertically, sometimes horizontally, as we have here. So we have our requirements. This is very generic. Our requirements become the inputs to the process. Then we have the operations, the outputs, which become our products and services. And overlaid at each step, there may be risk. There may be elements of risk. And again, you're actually recognizing these risks all the time, even if you're not explicitly aware that you're doing that. Now, in considering processes and processes within our quality management system, there are in fact three families of processes. There are what we call the MOPS. These are our management-oriented or business processes. We have our COPS, or our customer-oriented processes, the core processes, that which actually makes the money, the reason that we exist, to deliver what it is our customers require through the core processes relating to that. And then our SOPS, our support-oriented processes. So MOPS, COPS, and SOPS are the three types of processes that within your management system you're already working with, in fact. So looking at our core processes, our customer-oriented processes, some examples here that I'm sure will be familiar to you both in your work and from your knowledge of the standard. We have the sales process, contract review, design, manufacturing, picking and packing, dispatch, handling of complaints. These are all things that to some extent directly impact on the customer. And these are the sort of coalface type processes, if you like. Then we have our support processes, our SOPS. And these would be things, again, that will be familiar to you. We need support in terms of our document control, perhaps, training, purchasing, planning, calibration, maintenance, our IT provision, internal corrective actions. These are all very important processes that we need to manage what we're doing, but they're not going to directly impact on the customer. Hence, they are the support processes. And then our management processes, or business processes. And again, these will be familiar to you from the standard. We have the management review process, internal audit process, managing our customer feedback could be considered a management process, and then there are other high-level processes that don't directly impact the customer, things like perhaps a budget setting process. So lots and lots of management processes that I'm sure you could add to that list. So this is a rather busy slide, but I just want to try and demonstrate, hopefully, the simple concept. We have our input on the left-hand side, our customer requirements, and then running across the middle of the slide, we have our core processes, our operations processes. So these are our COPS, the things that we need to directly do to fulfill our customer requirements. So we have sales, design, purchasing insofar as it affects the customer's product directly, the manufacturing of the product or the processes you go through to produce a service, and the release of the product or service. So we have those core processes. And then above that, we have our MOPS, or our business processes, and they're detailed. There we have our customer satisfaction process, our management review, internal audit, and so forth. And then underneath, supporting, literally holding up from where we're sitting, we have our support processes. And again, that's our IT, our monitoring and measurement, our documented information, organizational knowledge, all of those things that are supporting our core activities. So hopefully you can recognize all of these things that you're already working with within your management system. But these are different types of processes. And then we overlay, again on that, the points at which we need to consider risk, or indeed risk and opportunity, and that's the clause 6.1 in the 2015 standard. And in fact, from here on, I hope I can make clear that process and risk are really quite closely entwined. So that moves us on nicely to risk-based thinking. And just to remind you, if you do have any questions or comments, do send them in as we go along in the chat box on your screen. So I have taken some text here from the standard. I don't want to dwell too much on the standard. That's not really the point of today, but really just to reiterate and emphasize the things that I have been saying and where they sit within the standard. So we have the requirement for a quality management system, including the processes needed and their interactions. And so far I've tried to illustrate the simple principles around processes and their interactions. So you need to determine the processes for your system. And in doing that, all the things we've been saying, so this is just a refresher slide really, we need to determine the inputs required and the outputs expected from these processes. And of course that's what our management system is about. Are we getting the correct outputs? And if we're not, what systems do we have in place to respond to that? So we need to think about the sequence and interaction, all those operations that we need to carry out, sequence and interactions of those processes. And we need to think about the risks and opportunities as determined in accordance with the requirements of 6.1, which of course we all know is the clause, actions to address risks and opportunities. And in that clause, the standard is very explicit about risk and opportunities, and in the clause 4, it's very explicit about the process approach and taking account of risks and opportunities within that. So, process and risk. The standard closely links process and risk, and as I've just indicated, this is particularly explicit in clause, it happens to be clause 441F, which cross-references clause 6.1, that's risks and opportunities. But in fact, there are lots of references to risk within the standard, but the vocabulary risk is not always used, but the vocabulary of risk is frequently used. So we have terms throughout the standard, is appropriate to, within the context of strategic direction, doing something that is appropriate in a particular context is a measure of risk. It's a recognition of risk. Potential impact on the conformity of product. Again, this is terminology and concepts that in the quality profession we've worked with for a long time. We in fact have always worked with risk. Objectives shall be relevant to the conformity of products. What do we need to do to ensure that our products conform? The level of control that's going to be needed would be related to the risk of a product not conforming. Potential consequences of failure, that's just another way of expressing risk or analysing what the risk might be. To ensure there is no adverse impact on conformity to requirements. So these are terms, themes that I would suggest we're already very familiar with and very comfortable with. And we had these before the 2015 standard. So we've always worked with risk. We've just used a different vocabulary of risk. So risk references actually pervade the standard. Personally, I think this is a very helpful matrix. Those of you that have listened to earlier webinars on the transition will have seen this before and will know how enthusiastic I am about it. It was actually put together by a colleague, but we have the specific in the second column there, we have specific ISO 9001 2015 requirements, and if we move over to the right, the word risk on the clauses we've identified here, we only get 6 explicit references to risk. But look at the number of other references that there are, again using the vocabulary of risk: complex, impact, effect, likelihood, consequence. So the standard is in fact peppered with references to risk, and indeed the 2008 standard was peppered with references to risk. So in that sense, it's not terribly new. Again, looking at process flows, a lot of you, I'm sure, will have come across the concept of the turtle diagram, and we have here the process turtle with our inputs, our process or our operations, and our outputs. And then we have the various resources and support processes around that. So start to see the turtle shaping up here. So we have with what in the top left-hand corner there, that's the resources that we need. How are we going to carry out these activities? These will be some of the support processes, and then we have the explicit reference there underneath to the support processes, and that will be including things like logistics and sales and preventive maintenance. And then over on the right-hand side, we have the reference to the people involved and the competences they might need, or the subcontractors that we might need to use. And then in the bottom right-hand side, we have the results, the measures. What is it that we need to measure or should be measuring? So we have a mixture in here of the resourcing and the MOPS and SOPS, the management processes, and the supporting processes there. And then the other theme of today, we can overlay on that our risk-based thinking, bearing in mind that at any point in our process, in any activity, there could be an element of risk and indeed opportunity. So we need to be conscious of that. In considering risks, I'm starting off here with some high-level examples. You will find increasingly your auditor will be asking you about risks. And in general, I would say there are the high-level risks. So if I'm talking to a chief executive or a managing director and say, what are the risks? What is it, would worry you, or what's on your risk register? So at the high level, not surprisingly, this Brexit comes pretty high on the list at the moment. Another example would be competition, which I think is probably a pretty well recognized risk in businesses. Changing technologies, a very important risk area that certainly managers have to watch quite closely, because they may need to react, and perhaps react quite quickly to fast-changing technologies. A risk that I encounter a lot, certainly in my work, is there might be a limited supply base. You're limited in the suppliers that you can use. What are the risks there? How do you overcome these? You try and widen your supply base where you can. And at the other end of that scale, so to speak, you might have a limited customer base, and there are risks associated with that. If you operate with a small number of customers, each giving you a lot of business, what happens if one of those customers disappears or decides to source their products or services elsewhere? So that is another important high-level risk that managing directors would certainly be applying their minds to. Then looking at the operational level, and again, you should increasingly find your auditors at the operational level asking about risks, perhaps not necessarily using the word risk directly, but I certainly increasingly, when looking at a process, might say, what are the risks here? What might go wrong? So what might go wrong in different processes? Well, if you're a warehouse and you're picking a lot of product, there may be some picking errors. This is a risk, an inherent risk in this process. That can be mitigated by something like a peer check. So one of your peers might check what you've just done and sign off perhaps to say, yes, I have checked this and it is correct. So that is a risk reduction mechanism at the operational level. Within the workforce or within a team of people, you may perceive some lack of understanding or carelessness. We all get careless, we all get overconfident when we do something day in, day out. We mitigate that risk perhaps with toolbox talks from time to time or team briefs. So these are activities that we inject as risk mitigation steps. A common one, perhaps less so now, perhaps with increasing use of cloud, but loss of data. And that could be a significant risk to an organization. So there are various ways of dealing with that, some sort of daily backup of the data, a backup off-site is a fairly common way of reducing that risk. Errors in receipt of orders, particularly receiving perhaps information over the phone. Again, probably becoming less and less the case with increasing use of the web and emails for taking orders. So certainly some of my clients are increasingly moving into or looking at some sort of web ordering system where the customer does the direct inputting, and that reduces the risk of somebody misunderstanding or making an error when they receive an order. Communication errors or misunderstandings, like the example I've just quoted of taking an instruction by phone, a confirmation email, for example, would be a mechanism for risk reduction. Now, you're probably looking at all of these and thinking, well, these are very standard things that go on, and indeed you're absolutely right. They are all mechanisms whereby you have recognized a risk and are doing something about that risk, even if you didn't think of it as a risk or call it a risk. It's a prevention mechanism. We're back to that old term, prevention. And another risk could be equipment failure. And again, if it's critical that you keep your process running, you've got to keep your water pumped if you're a water supply company, and you'll ensure that by having standby equipment or backup equipment, and that's your risk mitigation. So, looking at our process risk analysis, I think it's fair to say that most errors, or certainly a lot of errors, occur where one process interacts with another. And you could think of it like a relay race. What's the risk in a relay race? What are the problems that occur? It's actually at the handover. You're handing over the baton, and that's where there might be a problem if you're not lined up correctly or, you know, working together well. And this, of course, is where the silos, the organizational silos, can be a problem, because if you're working in silos, you're not getting an overview of the full process, and that's where the errors can creep in. I suspect a lot of you listening in need to do some internal auditing from time to time, and increasingly we are encouraging people to think about a process approach in their internal audits, starting with follow your process from perhaps receipt of an order or purchase of raw material right through to delivery to the customer, and perhaps any post-delivery processes that you may have. So in thinking about internally auditing with the process thinking, process approach, you need to establish what your key processes are. And look at the areas of weakness. What measures have you already got? What reports are there that can tell you where your quality might be failing? And this will give you some insight to the risks to quality. Looking at a process, what is it actually trying to achieve? That's a good question just to ask. What are you trying to do here? And how do you know you're doing a good job? That's the question I often put when somebody's describing a process to me. How do you know you're doing a good job? How do you know it's working? It could be looking at management reports. It could be just the answers that people give you, and then you can use those answers to go and probe a little bit further. So there's nothing magical here, and you don't have to make heavy weather of it, but you're actually looking at a process and asking people about the risks. So you need to focus on those processes that are perhaps not performing. But of course, how would you know that a process isn't performing? You would only know if you're very clear what the output should be, and you're clear what you should be measuring within that process. So auditing a process, first of all, who is the process owner? And certainly any of you that have seen any of our reports recently will know that we increasingly are looking at things like who's the process owner, what are the inputs and outputs and measures. So we need to establish the following. Who is the customer of the process and what's their expectations? And it could be an internal customer, remember. Are there any objectives and targets associated with it? Are these appropriate to the risks? That means in some way you've got to try and ascertain what the risks are. Are there any measures or performance indicators associated with it? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the results that we're getting? Is the process effective? Are they doing anything to try and improve? Who are the people carrying out this process, and what are their competence levels? What skills do they actually need? How do you know the process is working well? And what records do you have? What inputs to the various categories of process that you're operating? These are the sort of questions you can be, I was going to say firing, that sounds a little bit aggressive. These are the sort of questions you can be putting in the course of your audit. Please, please don't treat this as a checklist. Treat it as a conversation. As I said near the start, we're all learning, and this skill and this approach will become, you'll become increasingly more confident with it. So that I'm not offering you a checklist, I'm just giving you a flavour of the sort of questions, the sort of approach that you can adopt here. And of course, is information correct and up to date? That's a fairly standard audit type of inquiry. Very important, the process approach is actually about effectiveness, not compliance. And I would say that this is really the significant change that we need to think about. Historically, we concentrated on procedures and complying with the procedure. There were a set of requirements with which we had to comply. But we need to increasingly ask ourselves, is our process effective? So what do we need to measure? I would suggest you need to measure those elements of the process that you cannot afford to have go wrong. And we're back to our friend risk. So what are the significant risks in your process, and have you got appropriate measures to indicate whether or not you're achieving what you should, whether or not your process is effective. So you need to understand your process. You need to recognize the risks within the process. You need to prioritize those risks, because there will be lots of risks and some will be more significant than others, I would suggest. Having prioritized those risks, set appropriate objectives or measures for those risks. Take mitigating action to reduce the risk and achieve the objectives. And we've talked already about mitigation. And measure and evaluate your performance, the performance of your process. So, what might go wrong should drive your objectives. Objectives drive what we need to measure. Are your quality objectives therefore appropriate for your risks and context? And I think that's a question well worth asking yourselves now. And I've had this conversation with a number of my clients. What are your quality objectives? What are your risks? Do they actually align? Because the most valuable quality objectives that you will have, are those that will help you with your risks. So, effectiveness. Does the process actually help us achieve the planned results? Are we getting the customer satisfaction that we need? How might we measure that customer satisfaction? Well, of course, there's the direct talking to the customer, but you can measure things like the complaints, the number of complaints that come in. You can be measuring your level of on-time delivery. That's a very nice process measure there. You can look at the efficiency of your process. You might be getting good results. You can then look at the resources that you're deploying to get those results. Are you being as efficient as you might be? And of course, there are internal measures, both of satisfaction and efficiency. Are you achieving good productivity? In other words, is your machinery reliable, or are you subject to perhaps significant machinery downtime? That's going to cause problems internally. That's ultimately going to affect perhaps your on-time delivery. So you need to think carefully about what are the things you really should be measuring. Pause for thought. I recently spotted this on an organisation's notice board. Customers hate risks. Quality starts by knowing the risks. And we move now to context. I'm not going to say a huge amount this afternoon about context, partly because I think I've probably flooded you with a lot of information, which you will be able to listen to or look at again, because we are recording this session. And again, can I remind you, if you have any questions or comments, please do keep them coming in. So again, those of you who have listened to previous webinars, we do touch on context from time to time, and it includes consideration of the organisation's goals and intended outcomes, internal and external issues. These are themes lifted from the standard and what it says on context. We need to think about our interested parties and their requirements, and of course we need to think about the management system scope. That's an important element of the context. And overall, what we're looking for in context is really a complete understanding of the organisation. So we're not looking for a checklist or a tick list, but we're looking really to get some key insights to the organisation, to get illumination and clarity, so that we collectively have an understanding. What is this organisation? Where does it sit? What is its place within the wider world? And that theme, I've quoted it directly there from the CQI, a briefing note that they issued some 2 years ago now, when we first started talking about context. So it's a combination of internal and external factors that will influence or have an effect on an organisation's approach really to how it does business or how it needs to do business. So the approach to its products, services, investments, its interested parties. And indeed, earlier this year, In Touch did have an article to explain context and suggest possible ways of identifying context and associated interested parties. So you might be interested to have a look at that. For example, a number of organizations have used PESTLE or a SWOT analysis to help them brainstorm their context. And of course, this will also help you with your risk. So risk and context are, again, closely entwined here. So in doing something like a SWOT analysis, we can think about our internal and external issues. We can think of the risks and opportunities associated with those issues. We can tease out who we believe our interested parties to be. I'm often asked, how far do we need to go with the interested parties? When do we stop drawing up the list? This is something, you know, it's never going to be a totally complete exercise, but like everything, you can have your interested parties, you prioritize those interested parties. At a later date, you may think, actually, we've missed off an important interested party, so we need to consider that also. So none of these things are ever totally complete. There's a continuum. You'll always be refining and reviewing your approaches. So, looking at the issues to consider, some examples to think about. When it comes to context, I often feel examples help to illustrate the point perhaps a little bit better. What size of organisation are we? How complex are we? Who owns us? Ownership is a very important element of the context. Are we a small family owned, or are we part of something much bigger? Who are our interested parties? And just some examples that come to mind, but this will vary from organisation to organisation. There are the obvious ones: customers, consumers. Now when I say consumer here, I'm thinking of a consumer who perhaps is not directly ordering or paying for the service, but nevertheless has a view on it as a recipient of it. We may be a membership organisation. That's a different type of interested party. We may be a highly regulated organisation, in which case the regulators are going to be an important interested party. All of these things are going to influence the risks that we need to think about, will influence the context within which we work. External issues could be legislation, competition, the political climate, the economy. All of these things are going to influence our context, influence what we need to consider in developing our management system. Looking at the internal issues: ownership, who owns the business, who owns the premises in which we're operating. Lots and lots of organizations are in leased properties. Employees are an internal issue, shareholders, trustees, all of these internal issues, and of course these are also interested parties. So organizations vary greatly in their governance, in their complexity, in their customer base, their speed of response, their ability to respond quickly or not, their speed of decision making, the degree of formality required, and their culture. In fact, all of those things, I would suggest, are all part of the overall culture of an organization. So the context is going to be a very significant factor in your risk and in the type of systems you ultimately need to be operating. So each of those facets that I've detailed there influence or should influence how we view risks, priorities, and hence the management system requirements, the overall system requirements. So that's all I was planning to say this afternoon. And again, if you have a question, do please fire it through to us, and I can take any questions or comments now. Right, I have a question here. The presentation is focused nicely on the emphasis of the new version, but when you move from previous versions, what are the main things to change? What is the minimum expected adaptation required? I think the main change has to be the process thinking, and associated with that the risk-based thinking. So I keep saying we've always worked with risk. I think you need to more explicitly be aware of risk and process. And I think the shift has to be less focus or less worry about procedures, although if you're working with procedures and they work for you, by all means, don't change anything there. But I think to develop a more process approach thinking, think about your processes. That may lead you to decide to do some flow charting. It's not a requirement, but it's a very, very useful thing to do. And again, to then explicitly think about the risks around that. I'd like to think that where we have built in lots of checks and balances within how we work, that we'll collectively have a better understanding of those as risk reduction techniques, and also to think about, do we really need them? Is our level of risk such that we need to build in all these steps? You might actually decide your risks are not as significant as you've been approaching them. So there's just some thoughts around that which I hope will help. I've had a question, will the presentation be available after today? Yes, it will. We will send copies to everybody who's listening in this afternoon. You'll receive a copy. Oh, sorry, I'm told it'll be available next week. So I have a question here. Would you expect the risk-based thinking to percolate all the way down to individual work instruction levels, or is it generally acceptable to consider it down to process level? I would say it's a process level thing, the risk-based thinking. It's going to influence the instructions that you give. I suspect the instructions you're giving are in fact taking account of the risks. The way a task is carried out will be taking into account of the risks. It could be a good opportunity if you're training people or assisting them with instructions to start to talk about risk. So it could be a good opportunity to have that conversation at that level. But I wouldn't make heavy weather of it, if I can put it that way. I think keep it at the process level. I have a question here. Do we need to identify risk opportunities in every process? I would suggest you need to ask yourself the question in every process, what is the risk? Now, processes can be very high level or they can be very detailed. All processes can probably be broken down into further sub-processes. So perhaps what is behind your question is, does there have to be a risk at every sub-process? And I suspect there doesn't. But when you're looking at a process or breaking your activities down into processes, just ask yourself the question. But if there isn't a risk, there may be an opportunity don't forget about the opportunities. But I would say don't angst about it. If you can't see an obvious risk, don't get too concerned about it, because it's maybe already been adequately addressed. And I have another question here. Practically, is it recommended to prepare a document with those new approaches description? I have to be honest, I'm not terribly clear what the question means. Could I perhaps ask the questioner to clarify that? I think this is a clarification of the question. To have something like a quality manual I see what you mean. I think you're asking, should you have documentation or prepare new documentation to describe the things I've been talking about? It's entirely up to yourself, really. If you're going to have, I wouldn't change documentation that you've got at the moment. This is a message we keep reiterating. Any documentation you are currently using, if it's serving you well, then please carry on using it. Once you start thinking about process and risk and context, it may help you to start to capture these things in some way, and that would be typically in some sort of a document. So if it helps you, yes, by all means generate some more documentation, but only what's helpful to you. This is not about, in fact, the 2015 standards are very much about moving away from documents for documents' sake. It's very much about documentation that's helpful to you. Thank you very much for listening in this afternoon, and thank you very much indeed for your questions. Some very good questions, may I say. You got me scratching my head once or twice. I'd just like to thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this webinar. I do hope it's been helpful to you. I've certainly enjoyed putting it together. And please do keep your questions and comments coming in, even after today. As we indicated, this has been recorded, so you can listen to it again or encourage your colleagues to listen to it if they've missed it. And indeed, if there's anything we could do better or any topics you'd like to see covered in a little bit more detail, again, do let us know. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you and goodbye.